Thanks for tuning back in to see what's going on with Project Overland Bison. And today we have a complete how-to and installation on a Hellwig Rear Sway bar. Now, this sway bar is not new to market. This has been something that they've offered for quite a few years, but it is an application that is limited to 2015 to 2020. I'm going to be working with them to create a validation for the 2021. Not anticipating any specific issues, but I'm looking at helping expand the coverage for the ZR2 Bison. Specifically, they've included a couple of extra parts in this box to make sure that I can clear that rear differential skid, and as well address some of the modifications that I have to see if they can have additional fitments. So I do have Piggyback King shocks. I also have Dayton Fab shock skids, and we want to take a look at to see if any of those things cause any interference. So stay tuned here. I have the complete installation video immediately following. First up, we've got to get the bushings here all lubricated. They do provide us with this silicone-based lubricant that we need to put on each of the bushings. Once we have it on the bushings, we're going to need to put a little bit here on the eyelet. This is the arm that will attach to the upper mount to the lower part of the sway bar, and I just pound these in with a hammer. Then we have the sleeve to put in. This will actually lock the bushing in place. It's got that hourglass taper inside, and this will need some lubrication as well. And same process here. Put a little lube on the sleeve, put a little lube inside the eyelet, and basically going to use the same hammer technique to press it in, and we need to repeat this for both sides. So once we get this one done, we have to repeat the same process for the other eyelet and arm. While we have the lube open, it's a good idea to go ahead and get the primary bushings for the sway bar done. These are the D bushings you'll see here. Basically apply a small amount of lubrication across all the surfaces on the inside and set these aside for later use. So the first thing we have to look at in mounting the sway bar is getting the two U-bolt mount points free and clear of any obstructions in the way. The first thing we're going to have to do is relocate this plastic bracket, and you're going to want to carefully take it apart so as not to crack it. And then once you loosen it up, we're going to move it to the other side of where the breather valve inserts into the top of the axle. This will give us enough room to put the U-bolt and still provide the necessary support for the brake line so that it doesn't have any issues just dangling above the axle. Now, I did notice here that there's a sticker that was what looked like an identifying tag on the axle housing. I'm just going to go ahead and use a little bit of degreaser and a scrub cloth here to get that out. I hate having the leftovers of a sticker or other things just kind of dangling around. So I'm cleaning that up first, and then I'll continue with getting that bracket mounted back up in its proper position. Continuing with the bracket mount, we're going to clasp the bottom. It's got 2 points here, one which actually connects the upper portion and locks the brake line in, and the bottom which will actually snap around the axle. And I'm only putting this up to a snug position so I can manipulate it while I am getting the U-bolt in position and the base plate. Anytime that I do a sway bar type mount, anything where it's just myself working under the vehicle, I typically like to have the plate ready, and I will put that over the U-bolt, and I will put just one of the retaining nuts on there so that I can get everything in position, and then put any of the spacer plates or the debushing holder on top with just one hand. And you'll see the benefit when we get to the point of mounting the sway bar on top of those mounts. Again, now we are working on the other side. We want to make sure that the same things are intact. There is a brake line on this side. There is no retainer, but there is a rubber bushing there that you're going to want to make sure is not missing, so that if there's any movement or vibration, we don't have the brake line rubbing against the metal portion, especially the threaded portion of the U-bolt. Moving along with the installation, I'm going to go ahead and put the two spacers. This is what's different from the traditional kit that Hellwig has offered. They provided an extra set of these 1/4-inch spacers to make sure that the system sits low enough to avoid the skid plate underneath the differential, and as well, it seems to also provide enough space for the skid plates that are on the shocks. In this case, I do have the Dayton Fab ones, but the thickness is pretty much same across the board. So regardless of which one you have, this will actually help provide additional clearance to make sure that the sway bar doesn't come in contact with either the skid plate for the differential or the skid plate for the shock. As you can see here, this is where having the one bolt technique of putting a bolt up and then allowing the other side to be loose gives me the opportunity to hang the one side and get everything with the spacers and washers all in order, then remove the other bolt on the other side and slip the part through the same bolt and put the nut on. Otherwise, you'd be fumbling with trying to hold the U-bolt, the spacers, the saddle, and the bushing retainer while trying to balance the sway bar on top of your shoulder, as you see here. So this is just something I've worked out over the years. When I am putting a sway bar on, going through this technique of putting in 1/2 of the bolt and the spacers just allows me to have my hand free, so I'm not trying to hold everything up, and at the same time make sure that nothing falls out while I'm working underneath the vehicle. While I have everything loosely hanging, I'm going to rotate the sway bar up into position and just observe anything that might be in the way, making sure that the U-bolts are free of causing any interference with that brake line, and of course looking at things like the skid plate. Next up, I have to put the link mount for the frame at the top in, and that requires sliding in a bracket through the top of the frame and the gap between that and the fender. There's also the inner fender liner, which you're just going to have to push up the edge and slide that bracket through. Once that's in place, you want to drop the bolt through and leave that hanging, and that bolt will pass through the slotted holes at the bottom of the mounting plate. Now, if you've got a sharp eye here, you'll realize that this plate is not the correct plate. I have contacted Hellwig, and they are sending me the correct one. This plate is in fact mirrored from the one that I need and is actually more a duplicate of the other side. But the installation procedure remains the same, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in for the sake of the video, and I'll be swapping this out at a later date. If you notice that I'm not completely tightening these down, that's because I want them loose so I can see how they hang relative to the sway bar position. Moving along back to the driver's side, you'll see that this is the correct plate. It does have the notch in the correct position. It is on the inbound side on the forward-facing edge, and you'll notice the eyelet is at the rearmost position. This is the correct position to make sure that the link that travels from this mount to the sway bar is perfectly vertical. Additionally, this makes sure that there's no issues with any interference with the shock, and in this case, the piggyback design of the King poses no issue with this design. Just like the other side, we are going to go ahead and put those bolts through. They pass through the same way from that upper bracket that we slid through the frame, poking through the inner fender liner, and those two bolts hanging down will have at the lower plate a washer and a nut underneath them. And the same thing goes for this side. We're going to get both of those set up and just hang loosely pending the installation of the sway bar and finding the exact position. Hanging the driver's side eyelet is next, and we're going to go ahead and put that bolt through, put a washer and a nut in there, and let it just hang down. I've got these approximately set, but we can do all the adjustment with the sway bar here. And as you can see, I'm going to put it into the orientation that's recommended by the instruction guide, but note as well that the front mounts are completely loose. This is just to get the positioning, and we'll do the same for the other side before we get anything tightened up. And we just want to put those eyelets on the bar so we can get an idea of where the bar is going to sit and eventually make the adjustments to each of those links to keep that bar as flat as possible. Another note here is that that link is threaded. This allows us to adjust for other suspension modifications such as a rear ride height change in a spring or a block. Now that everything's hanging loose, it's time to get the relative position of the bar to the axle setup. And here I'm just going to snug up the U-bolts just enough so that they hold tension against the bar so I can play with it and rotate it into its final position. In this process, I'm going to snug up each of the sides, and I'm going to be able to move the bar either left or right, and also rotate the position of the U-bolts up or down, making sure that obviously it clears not only the differential skid plate, the differential housing, but also the shock skids. We'll also be able to get an idea of what the height will be for those end links, and overall this is just to make sure that we don't have any interference while we're actuating the sway bar during normal operation of the vehicle. This is one of those steps I'm going to say spend some time on. You're not only going to want to get the visual alignment correct, but more importantly, make sure that when the sway bar is actuating, that it's going to clear all the necessary things. Specifically, we want to spend extra attention while we're tightening up to make sure that we're not going to either damage those brake lines running across the top of the housing, but also make sure that the bar itself isn't going to interfere with either shock movement or the skid plate on either end. With the sway bar in its final position, it's time for us to lock in those upper plates. I'm going to start here with the driver's side, and basically I'm going to make sure that it's moved to its most inbound position, keeping that eyelet as far away from the spring assembly. This gives us the most amount of movement so as not to have interference during articulation. Flat up and down movement, not an issue, but once we start moving side to side, it becomes more of that. Additionally, I'm looking at the eyelet on the bottom and seeing that the sway bar isn't exactly level. So here's where we have the opportunity to loosen that jam nut and thread it in to get the sway bar to a nice and level position. Once I got the eyelet through the hole, I did notice that the bar was moved too far to the passenger side. Keeping in mind that the bar needs to clear both the shocks on either side, or the skid on one side and the shock on the driver's side, I am going to apply a little bit of force, moving it closer to the driver's side, peering in to make sure that I'm not going to interfere with the shock's movement. That being said, I still found that the vertical link actually feels like it sits better when it's on the inside, which is opposite of what the instructions recommend. And now we're going to do the same for the passenger side. We have to lock in that plate and get everything torqued up to spec. Here I'm going to start with the inside bolt, making sure that it is in the furthest inbound position, and I'm going to lock that one into place, and then I'm going to move to the outside, hold the upper bolt, and then lock that one into place. If you do notice the difference on this side versus the other side, you will see that that vertical link actually has a forward list at the top position, and that is because that plate has the eyelet in the wrong position. Again, I'll be correcting that once Hellwig sends the correct plate back out for installation. With as tight as the tolerances are with this setup, we do have these locks that go on the inside of the sway bar on both sides of the eyelets. This prevents the bar from moving anywhere left or right. In particular, the ZR2 Bison has so many components that are back here. It is absolutely critical that they use these type of locks in there. A sway bar that moves left or right can actually cause interference with the shock on one side, or potentially rub against the bottom of the skid plate on the other. Now that we have the sway bar in its final position, the upper mount plates are locked in place, and for the most part we have the end links adjusted so that they're even on both sides. It's time to get everything up to final torque spec. Hellwig does provide a specification in the manual based upon the U-bolts that they provide, but additionally they also provide us with a jam nut that we're going to thread up to the bottom to make sure that none of that backs out. And while I am using my hand to bring these up to the bottom of the primary nut, these do require you to use a wrench and apply torque to them to make sure that they don't allow the primary nut to back out. And now that we're wrapping up the installation, we want to make sure that the lower eyelet on the connecting link is tight, as well as the top. We want to do this for both sides. And once we have that done and we're happy with the overall height and the position of the sway bar, we want to tighten up those jam nuts. And that'll be the last component that we have to tighten up for this installation. And that pretty much wraps up the installation. All bolt on, pretty straightforward. It even clears a lot of the aftermarket stuff I have here. No issues with the AEV rear differential cover with the Bison skid plate, but that was partly due to the fact that they've included this extra little shim here. That is not in the normal Colorado kit. That's one of the things they had presumed it would need for the ZR2, and it looks like it did, but it provides just enough clearance where there's no issue. Everything else here is pretty straightforward. I will note that I did turn this side of the eyelet on the opposite side. I did like the way it lined up better. It seemed to be pulling the arm more when it was pushed on the way that the instructions had it here. It's not going to really change how the system works, but for the most part just gives it a little bit cleaner install. And there you go. Sway bar is on, and we're ready to take it out to the street to see just how it performs, and then ultimately out to the trail to see if we need to change or adjust these leverage points and maybe use one with a little bit more bar. But that's the whole point of this, is to see what works on the trail and what complements the new softer ride of the Kings.